They were here sharing their perspective on the electricity sector. Today we are here with Dr. Lawrence Jones. Dr. Jones holds a PhD in electrical engineering. Dr. Jones, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So we will want to begin by you telling us your background and what drove your passion of entering the electricity sector as an electrical engineer.
First of all, thanks for having me. My interest in electricity goes back to when I was growing up in Liberia.
Okay.
My father was an engineer. He worked at the time it was called the Public Utilities Authority.
Okay.
And that was where I gained a lot of interest in the issue of electrifying not just the world, but electrifying societies more broadly.
Okay.
And specifically, that interest grew as I traveled outside of Liberia, and I went to school in Sweden. I studied at the Royal Institute of Technology, and there my interest got even deeper.
Okay.
And I've always had a passion for the power of light, and I believe that access to vision allows you to expand your horizon, expand your imagination. And I think electricity is a catalyst, it's the foundation for modern society, and that has been something that has captivated my thinking, my life over most of my career focused on electricity. So hence my passion for electricity, because I see the value of it and I see what it can do to society.
That's awesome. So probably you talk about all of what drove your passion. You realize, do you care to tell us about some of those issues that drives the passion of reading us? I mean, you should be a lover of books. Do you care to tell us about some of the books that are related to electricity and just to share a perspective on that?
Yeah, so I'm an avid reader. I love to read, and one of the things I truly believe in is that expanding one's knowledge through curiosity can be fed from reading books.
Okay.
I've always loved books, and so at the moment I actually run something called the Influential Minds at the Edison Electric Institute, where we bring together world leaders from different fields and talk about their professions. And that allows me to read books from all kinds of backgrounds. And at the moment, three that I'm reading that I would love to share with your audience.
Okay.
One is a book by our colleague who you mentioned, my good friend Marco Montefiore, based in Switzerland. Mark has written a book called Energy Citizenship. And it is a book that really digs into the fundamentals of energy, how we relate to it as citizens, and how energy sort of basically defines our lives. And so that's certainly a book that Mark has talked about. He was here in Liberia with me the last week or so, and really one that I'm enjoying reading, one that I would highly recommend. As part of the Influential Minds series that I mentioned, there are two books that I'm currently reading that I love to share with the audience. One, which is very, very interesting because it goes back to the history of electricity. It's a book by a gentleman called Eric Weiner. The book is called Ben and Me, and Ben being Benjamin Franklin, who is the father or one of the fathers of the United States in terms of his work and his contribution. This is an interesting book because Franklin, as many people know, did not graduate from high school. In fact, he was a dropout. So he was a self-taught man who got so passionate about electricity. He did the kite experiment. He basically went on to become the first U.S. diplomat. So understanding the life of Franklin has really taught me a lot about the world today and how we can learn from his generation. And then the last book that I'm reading is a book by an author by the name of Sally Adi. The book is called We Are Electric. And this book actually speaks to the fact that there's a new field that is evolving, which speaks to what is called bioelectricity. And it goes back to talking about that our bodies itself is a function of electricity, and how electricity is prevalent across our society and also in our bodies. So these are just three examples of books that I'm reading that helps to inform my thinking and my own thought leadership as I engage with folks around the world on this very important topic of electricity and energy.
Okay, that's awesome. So before we looked into electricity, firstly, You've been in Liberia. You have a history with Liberia and the Liberia Electricity Corporation. So could you walk us through the history of the electricity sector in Liberia? And probably would like to highlight few differences between what was then and now, based on your observation. How will you again rate the sector in terms of performance and considering its past performance? And what are some of the key indicators you would like to highlight?
This is a great question because, as someone who believes in history, one of the things I have done on this trip is to use the dragonfly as a mascot, because the dragonfly has this very keen ability, because of its visual capability. It can actually look forward, look backwards, and look on the sides at the same time. And I say that because history is important as we look forward to decide the future of energy in Liberia or any country of the world. It's important to understand history. So in the context of the LEC, before there was the LEC that was established in 1973, there was actually something called the Public Utility Authority. And that was an agency that basically was the precursor to the LEC. And what that did, it allowed the bringing together of all the utilities in the country at the time, basically the public utilities. It was the utility for electricity, the utility of water, and eventually those public utilities were splintered, as best as my memory can serve me, and now you have the LEC as a separate corporation, and you have the Liberian Water and Solar also as a separate corporation. So that splinter that occurred led to the creation of the LEC. Over the years, as I grew up here, and as I said, I feel like I'm a baby in the electricity sector because I was there from my father being involved with the LEC. I went into Mount Coffee when I was 5 years old. So I've seen this industry, this sector in Liberia evolved. And it evolved in a sense where maybe 20 years, 30 years ago, Liberia had a very successful functioning electricity sector. But as we all know, the onslaught of the civil war in Liberia literally destroyed the entire infrastructure when it comes to electricity. And what has been happening has been this sort of a stepwise, gradual approach to rebuilding the infrastructure. And there's been some starts and fits in this process, but I think being on the ground for the last couple of weeks, what I have seen is the steady progress in terms of rebuilding the infrastructure, rebuilding the human capacity. One of the things that have really struck me on this trip is the amount of effort that the LEC has made in building the capacity of Liberians to man the Liberian electricity sector or electricity corporation. As many people know, for the past decade or so, the LEC have been run under various management service contracts with non-Liberian executives, if you may. And over the past 2 years, as my sources informed me, it's now solely run by a Liberian management team, more or less. The engineers, technicians, most of them are Liberian owned. So I think that speaks to the evolution of a sector, of a utility, of an industry that was totally devastated during the war. And today, it's making progress. And so the question about KPIs, there are two things that stood out to me over this trip. One, the amount of effort the LEC is making now to reduce what we refer to in the industry as non-technical losses. Those losses have reduced. Are they still pretty high? Yes, they are. But they've come down significantly compared to maybe 2 or 3 years based on the LEC's performance report that was released earlier this year. The other thing that struck me is the level of interest that I see amongst the LEC management team and the engineers and technicians to really want to make the effort to reduce lack of access to electricity. And so, for example, 2 things that stand out. One, as it relates to non-technical losses, the anti-theft task force that was established by the government under the leadership of the LEC CEO, Amani Captain, and also the former mayor of Monrovia, Mrs. Mary Bro, as one way to mitigate the power theft in the country. That's one thing that I find very creative, very innovative. The other thing that was very interesting and encouraging was the attempt made by the LEC, or the efforts being made by the LEC, to basically expand access to electricity in other communities outside of urban Monrovia. And so they have an initiative that is called the GAP communities, that is fully funded by the LEC, which is, I guess, one of the first time over the last maybe decades, at least 2 decades, that the LEC is in a situation that way it can actually fund some of these initiatives to bring electricity to the other parts of Monrovia and other parts of the country. So in some, I would say, reduction of non-technical losses and the expansion of energy access by self-investment, not being funded by donors, but actually funded by the LEC. So those are two things I think are very critical to highlight as we look at the continuous development and continued growth of the LEC.
Great. You spoke of power theft, and considering that the demand for electricity is so high with low capital investment, what do you think could be a more best practice or a mechanism to be able to resuscitate the electricity sector, considering that electricity, is on the demand and there is low capital investment? What will you, recommend as the best way to move forward?
I think this is a very interesting question that has multiple aspects that could bring about multiple recommendations. But let me just zero in on 3 initial recommendations or initial steps I think should be considered. I think the first step is to recognize that you cannot develop an electricity sector without having access to capital. So capitalization of the LEC is key, and how that is done is one that I think we need to focus on to make sure it's right. Now, to capitalize means you have to attract investments. Investments can be multifold. It can come from within Liberia. Liberians themselves can invest in the LEC. It can come from outside. But for both of those things to happen, you need to have the right regulatory, the right policy, the right governance, and the right legal structures in place. And just give one thing when it comes to governance, we need to make sure that the governance in terms of the relationship between the management team and the board is one that the board is actively working to assist the management team by promoting the LEC, both the international stakeholders but also to domestic stakeholders as a way of attracting investments. The other thing, as we specifically relates to then the need for having a sort of enforceable legal framework, is to understand the repercussions of, for example, not paying your bills or stealing power. Those measures require a stern action on the part of the government to enforce those laws that will enable the LEC to do its job. I think the last point in terms of this trio of initial steps that I would recommend is to look at the whole idea of how LEC ownership is structured, in the sense that many places around the world, you ask me the question about best practices. I always say that ownership of a utility does not necessarily have anything to do with the operation of the utility, but it does impact some of the decision making. So I think as we look at an organization like the LEC, based on my experience from dealing with utilities around the world, there needs to be a very direct effort to make sure that there's independence in terms of the execution of the vision and mission of the LEC. There needs to be independence in terms of the strategic decisions being made by the LEC. And then the oversight provided by the board should be led by a vision for where LEC ultimately needs to be in terms of the broader vision of the country. I've always said, and I've said on this trip as well, and some of my colleagues who were here also reiterated that fact, you cannot electrify a country if you don't know where that country is going. And so I think what LEC needs in terms of guidance from its stakeholders, be it government, investors, whoever, is what is the ultimate development strategy for Liberia, because that is the strategy that LEC strategy is going to have to support. The LEC cannot develop a strategy in a vacuum, so we need to understand, and we see this all over the world, electrification will happen when there is an industrialization strategy, and it will also happen when there is a strategy that will promote where the country ultimately needs to go. So those are some initial ideas I'll put on the table as we look at the continued positive evolution of the LEC going forward.
Great. So, one thing that is very, very important here in Liberia is that during the dry season, the Une hydro we do have, the water level during dry season it decreases significantly. In other countries during these kind of a crisis, what are some of the mechanisms that they do put in place?
That's a great question that has historical context because this problem facing Liberia now is not a new problem.
Mm.
We've had droughts over the years. We've had droughts going back or dry low water levels going all the way back to the 70s and 80s. Obviously, because of the onslaught of climate change and some of the issues around warming weather, we're seeing a drop in precipitation around parts of the world. We've seen droughts that bring very huge evaporation. So we should expect going forward that we'll have low water levels during the dry season.
Mm-hmm.
What most countries do is they try to look at their overall portfolio of energy solutions, not just trying to sort of tackle it by one source, but looking at it holistically. And so I would say in the context of Liberia, what needs to happen is, or two examples or two recommendations, suggestions if you may. The first one is we need to take an all of the above approach to dealing with the seasonal challenges we have when it comes to hydro levels. For example, we know that demand is high in the summer, in the dry season. So a demand response program where during the dry season, the LEC will develop a strategy where customers can shift their loads or shift their consumptions during different times of the day. And in return for that will be a certain mechanism for making such shift in terms of the consumption. So demand response program is one thing that's clearly discussed a lot. In fact, during this visit here, we had one of our colleagues participating from Australia, Ian McLeod, at some point, who talked about how they were able to reduce almost 600 megawatts of demand by shifting demand on their system. So there are a lot of examples around the world where you can do that to sort of tackle that. The other thing to do in terms of that is to look at having in place what I call a more systemic approach to dealing with the dry season. And there are three things that come to mind. First, we need to think about energy efficiency. We need to think carefully how to get consumers to be more efficient in how they consume energy, especially during the dry season. Two, we need to have incentive programs that will accelerate that transition to much more efficient practices during the dry season. The other thing that I think, and this is a bit bigger, broader, but we need to think about the industrialization of Liberia and what industries could do. One of the things people don't realize is that in the past, when Liberia, say maybe 30, 35, 40 years ago, when you had huge mining companies operating in Liberia, you had Lamco, you had Bong Mines, those companies had their own on-site generation of a certain size. And so during the rainy season, LEC would sell electricity to them or share electricity with them. And in return, during the dry season, they would then share electricity with the LEC. That was one way to balance out the fluctuation. The other thing I would say, today with technology coming, we have energy storage being developed around the world, so LEC can explore energy storage as one option. The other big thing that I think is more regional is, as we're in West Africa today and the Mano River Union, droughts are not confined to just Liberia. So we have Liberia going through some droughts during the dry season. We have the same situation in Ghana, in Cote d'Ivoire, in parts of Sierra Leone. So this is a regional challenge that the region is facing. My recommendation, I've discussed with several executives in the region, is instead of one country building a huge generation source to deal with the fluctuation of power during the dry season, why not there be a regional power plant that is built specifically to serve the region during the dry season? And that could be say a 200 megawatt plant or a 300 megawatt plant. It could be run by natural gas, for example. It could also be a very large solar plant that will be shared by the region. That way, you reduce costs. One, two, it allows the regions to share capacity, which will reduce the overall burden on one single country. So I think those are just some examples. But again, even when it comes to the seasonal planning issue, what we need to focus on, what I think Liberia, the LEC should focus on, is the ability to have a holistic plan that looks at all of the above strategies for how to deal with that. The last point I should mention, by the way, is education. I really believe it's important that the LEC double down. I know you have a very interesting, growing communications team. I think you need to increase that communication team because communications is important. And so communications where people are not just being informed after the fact, but they're being proactively informed. I think if LEC increases its communication or its investment in the communications team, that could help because we know that customer engagement begins with customer communication. So those would be some of the recommendations I would lay out at this point.
Great. So you have interacted with some other executives of outside the LEC and looking at your understanding, of the electricity sector. What do you think are some of the challenges, and especially when it comes to the managerial part of LEC? What do you think needs to be addressed?
Yeah, look, I think, look, and I said this earlier during my visit here the last couple of weeks, is that, a utility is a very critical asset or critical industry in any country. And the managerial team definitely needs to be allowed to operate as a managerial team. Two things I found very interesting here is that during these events we had at the LEC or when I was in Monrovia, most of those things were attended by executives. But be that as it may, the lights didn't go off. And that for me strikes me as the progress the executive team at LEC has made insofar as they can actually take hours of the day and go to an executive briefing, go to participate in an executive meeting, trusting in the junior level staff to keep the lights on. That demonstrates to me that the leadership of the LEC under the guidance of the leadership of Monica Tan is doing a good job in building capacity behind them so that when they're at the executive level have to deal with more strategic issues, they can rest assured that the technical team behind them is there to keep the lights on. And I think one of the challenges sometimes that executives have is that their job is not really understood by the average public or the average consumer. And I think that again ties back to communication, is educating not just the consumers but the policymakers, educating folks in other parts of the country, the government, the leadership, to understand that keeping the lights on is not a simple task. It looks simple because we flip the switch, the light comes on. But behind that switch, when it's flipped, there's a lot that goes on. And I think one of the challenges facing utilities, not just in Liberia, but across the world where I spend most of my time, is that there's a disconnect sometimes in what citizens, consumers, policymakers expect of the utility, or investors as well, and what the constraints the utilities are subjected to. Because, let's remember, utilities operate within a sort of a political economy where there are lots of issues that don't necessarily have to do with electricity, but affects the ability of the utilities to do their job. So I think understanding those complexities, developing proactive strategies to educate the stakeholders about what it means to keep the lights on are things I think if the LEC continues to do, there will be more success in what they're doing. But I think also one last point I would make in terms of managerial skills is that consumers, stakeholders by and large, need to understand that we cannot take electricity for granted, in the sense that the role of the utility executives, their managerial team, is one that requires continuity, is one that requires consistency, and is one that requires sort of a long-term thinking in terms of how to do it.
Close on this podcast. Many stakeholders and opinion leaders believe that privatization is the adequate solution to Liberia's electrification problem. As an expert, what will you say? What's your take on that?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I'm just gonna sort of cross my try to cross my leg here as I try to deal with that particular issue when it comes to that, right? I think the question you just raised about privatization is certainly one that requires us to understand what it means and how it's carried about. I've always said, as I traveled around the world and even here in Liberia, that for privatization to be successful, we have to understand why we're privatizing and do we have the fundamentals in place. And without the fundamentals, one needs to be very careful. We have a lot of examples around the world where people attempted to privatize an enterprise but not having the fundamentals in place. And so what I say to folks who talk about privatization is, first, they should understand what it is we're trying to do here. What is the ultimate goal? What is it that we hope to accomplish by looking at the governance structure? Let me give you one example. You previously asked me the question about investments. So some believe that by privatizing a utility, whatever that is, it will attract investments. And I don't disagree. In fact, within EI, we have a lot of our U.S. members, in fact, all our U.S. members are investor-owned. But the point is, we also have international members who are both investor-owned as well as municipalities. They're owned by state-owned enterprises. So the operational efficiency of a utility is not necessarily a function whether it's private or not, because you can have a private utility that doesn't necessarily live up to the expectations of what it's supposed to do. The key for me when it comes to privatization, anywhere in the world, including Liberia, is that we need to have the fundamentals right, and we don't have enough time in this podcast to talk about the fundamentals, but I can certainly talk to anybody wanting to understand the fundamentals that we need to put in place. That's the first thing. The second thing is to understand that we need to make a distinction between how privatization is carried about, what aspects of the utility business is privatized, make sure we can distinguish between ownership and governance, make sure we can ensure that governance does not necessarily get inhibited by what I would call undue interference by external stakeholders or into the role of the utility. And so I think we're at a very interesting place where we need to ask ourselves the question, how do we capitalize the operations of a utility, in this case LEC? There are many ways to do it. You could actually create a situation where Liberians could invest in a certain amount of stocks if LEC was put on the stock market, and they would buy shares in LEC. Private investors could come in under different kinds of contracts and constructs, and they would also be able to buy shares or own shares. The government could own shares in the LEC. I think if you have that level of sort of a diverse ownership with clear accountability, where the CEO, the board, they are all held accountable for the operations of the utility. There are clear KPIs. And the owners in this case would be the investors, would be the citizens. In fact, you can even have a case like we have in the Ivory Coast, where the company CIE is actually a company where its citizens, the citizens of Ivory Coast own shares, the employees of the company own shares, the government owns some shares, and private investors own shares. So I think if we could create a much more diverse ownership structure around the LEC, it would allow us to one, remove any undue sort of influence on the functioning of the LEC, let it run like a normal corporation where there are clear KPIs and where their shareholders can expect a certain dividend. Is LEC ready for the framework I just described? It could get there. Is it ready today? No, because I think you have to also look at the legal framework, the regulatory framework, and the governance structure. But I would think if we could do that, there are lots of Liberians at home and abroad who I believe would be interested in owning a certain amount of shares in the LEC to invest. So that would be my view on why we need to take a very balanced, measured approach to the notion of privatizing LEC. We should think about what it is we want, what it is that we need. But without the fundamentals, our focus should first and foremost be, let's strengthen LEC, reduce power theft, increase the amount of revenue LEC can generate, let LEC expand its customer base, build the infrastructure, because without the infrastructure, there's nothing to privatize. Build the infrastructure, and then let the management team continue to do what they're doing with as minimal interference from owners, shareholders, whoever, because electricity is such a critical sector, and we need to have some continuity in terms of when it's being successful. That's what I would say.
So based on all of these recommendations, compounded by the current trajectory of LEC, where will you see LEC in the next 6 years?
If we continue, and LEC continues, and I say we because they're a member of the Edison Electric Institute, our family of utilities, and we always like to welcome our family members and treat them as part of the utility family. If LEC continues down the path where they're on, I think in the next 6 years, one thing I think will happen, you will definitely see a reduction in non-technical losses. I think if we continue down this path that the LEC is on, you could definitely have a stronger workforce because the workforce is developing. I think that's important. I was out a few days ago with the LEC team and we visited some of the gap communities. And what was astounding was the fact that when you see the hunger and thirst for electricity that I saw amongst the community stakeholders, that alone is an indication of the growth potential that the LEC is sitting on. But let's remember, for that growth potential to be realized across Liberia, not just in Monrovia and its sort of surroundings, but across Liberia, there needs to be investments in the infrastructure. There needs to be investment in the human capacity. There needs to be continuity into the work that is currently being done. Because one of the things investors don't like is an unnecessary interruption of a steady stream of positive successes. Will there be challenges along the way? Absolutely. But I think if we can stay focused on this trajectory, that what I've seen, LEC is in a very good situation to be way ahead of where it is today in the next 6 years. But I think ultimately, that goal of electrifying the entire Liberia, making sure that there is universal access to electricity, for that goal to be realized, the LEC needs to know what is the government's ultimate vision for this country. And someone asked me the question 2 days ago about how long will it take to achieve these goals for the LEC. My message is my final thought here. If you give me the vision of Liberia for the next 50 years, not 10 years, you give me a 50-year vision for Liberia, I can do some sort of a analysis with my colleagues around the world and at least lay out some kind of a pathway to having full electrification of Liberia. But we need to understand that industrialization strategy and that overall long-term development goal and plan for Liberia.
Okay, so I see a green band on your hand. This is unusual. Do you care to talk about that?
Well, yes. Well, I'm very excited you asked that question. So this band is something that was created by a non-for-profit that I co-founded in the United States. And the band is for an initiative called 2020 by 2030. The goal here was to get 20 million Africans, young Africans, to learn to play the game of chess. Because I believe that developing critical thinking skills can be achieved by playing chess. And I think one of the key pillars for Liberia and any country in Africa are the youth. And if we can get the youth across Africa to really double down on improving their critical thinking skills, we would have laid the foundation for the future. So this little wristband is just one way to promote this challenge. It says Africa, your move. And again, your move is to get is to get 20 million young people in Africa to begin to play the game of chess. The initiative was originally supposed to be launched in Liberia the same year the Ebola pandemic broke out, so we had to put it on hold. But I'm wearing it today because I'm in Liberia and we are looking forward and hoping to engage with some of the folks here, including the Chess Federation of Liberia and others, as we want to see how we can reactivate this goal of getting 20 million young kids, including the ones in Liberia, to learn to play the game of chess and by so doing develop the critical thinking skills.
Great. So, and then final words, do you have something that we left out? So what you would like to tell the viewers?
Well,
what's your last words?
Well, my final word to the viewers is that electricity is clearly the pillar, the foundation of building any nation. Liberia has now commenced or is on this journey of electrifying this country. The LEC is at the helm of driving this development. The LEC needs the support of Liberians at home and abroad, as well as it needs the support of all the stakeholders. So I think let's stay focused, let's not get distracted. The dry season will bring a set of challenges, but let's be cheerful to realize that in those 5 communities I visited earlier this week, there were Liberians who for the last 30 years did not have access to electricity. They will now have access. My last closing remark or challenge to those Washingtons, just imagine if we can bring that joy to every community in Liberia by supporting these gap communities through the initiative of the LEC. That is one way to incrementally rebuild this country and rebuild the electricity system. That will be my final word. Let's get together and support more gap communities across this country.
Thank you. And for the last 35 minutes, we are with us here, Dr. Lawrence Jones. Dr. Jones is the Senior Vice President for International Programs at the Edison Electric Institute, the USA. Thank you, Doc, for having this time with us.
Thank you for having me.